It's before 8 here on Morning Live. Thanks so much for joining us. Now, the brutal murder of George Floyd is a lived reality of black people since the days of slavery, colonial conquest and white privilege. And these are the views contained in a somber letter of the Pan-African Bar Association of South Africa, PABASA, titled Justice for George Floyd. Now, PABASA says that the pain of black Americans is as real to black South Africans because of the perpetual racism against blacks that still exists in South Africa. The Association of Advocates holds the view that the alleged killing of Collin Khosa by the state and the state army depicts remnants of apartheid and colonialism, from where the alleged perpetrators have learned that black lives do not matter. President Cyril Ramaphosa and the ANC did not escape public criticism for issuing a statement on George Floyd's case, while an allegation of a similar death and other acts of brutality against civilians in this country also exist. PABASA chairperson advocate Moses Kakane, SC, joins us via Zoom, and also joining us on the same platform is political analyst Aubrey Mashikli. Dr. Mashikli and, of course, Mr. Kakane, thanks so much for your time this morning. Welcome to Morning Live.
Thank you. Thank you, Sakina.
Now, Mr. Kakane, let me start with you. Please explain to us the contrast that you see in the deaths of South African Collin Khosa and the views shared on social media with regard to what happened to George Floyd in the United States.
Well, the disdain that accompanied both killings made me draw the similarities because they symbolize what I think is the experience of black people all over the world who get killed for no apparent reason, simply because they are black and they are treated in such a manner with such indignity precisely because they are black. And that happens because of centuries of black experience under brutality of what I think is a design system of white supremacists.
But Koko Aubrey, looking at these two cases, could it be that we draw some sort of difference from it because Collin Khosa was allegedly killed by black law enforcers and George Floyd in the US driven by racism, allegedly because he was killed by white law enforcement officers?
Well, Sakina, the source of both killings is the same. It is white racism, which is a pathology of whiteness. In this way, when a black child is born, that black child is born with two things. Is born with the stain of racism on his or her soul, but together with that stain of racism comes internalized racism. And both stains come to that black child, her forefathers. And that is why you have seen young black people you would think who had not been affected by colonial oppression, protesting all over the world, because they were born with that stain, they were born with that pain. So to the extent that we're talking about internalized racism, a pathology of whiteness, those police officers or soldiers who killed Collin Khosa because what they've internalized because of racism is the idea that black lives are valueless. And therefore, when they look at another black person, they look at something that is like them, something that is black like them, and therefore something that is of no value, and therefore in that manner. If you go across the ocean, the reason we respond in this manner in this country to the killing of George Floyd is twofold. Firstly, we connect with the pain of black people all over the world, including the black people of the United States of America. And therefore, we connected with the pain of George Floyd as he was dying, especially his last moments. But something else happens, Sakina. As far as this is a media story, something that happens in the Congo has less of an impact than something that happens in the global north. So you have that situation too, where this becomes an important media story besides the popular imagination in South Africa, because it did not happen in the Congo, because it happened in the global north and in the West.
Now, Advocates Kakane, going back to the Association of Advocates and what you said there, holding that the killing of Collin Khosa and the fact that not much was said about it, not much was done about it. We see in the United States the outrage at the killing of George Floyd, people going and out on protest despite the fact that there is a lockdown. And you say that the government perhaps has learned this, its remnants from what they've learned from perpetrators of apartheid, that black lives do not matter. But how do we charge an ANC government with that when they fought for the liberation of black people in this country?
Well, that is the pervasive nature of what I would call, the context for this, is that the context is what I would call implicit social cognition. It means the body of knowledge we have about ourselves, even if we are activists, we're dealing with a colonial yoke we've been carrying for centuries. And so even the fact that people are liberators or are freedom fighters, it tells you that the yoke of colonialism, the yoke of looking at oneself as inferior, goes with us. And that memory is passed on from generation to generation. And I think that is what we see, is that even in the ANC, they're not immune to that. And so racism is a demon that I think affects all of us. And the ANC itself must look at itself closely as to why is it that the plight of Black people take second place? And why is it that its soldiers find it easy to pose for a photo with a white kid? And that is something that we must confront head on, because it's what we've carried through for centuries.
And I'm going to come to the whole issue of the vindication of soldiers who were involved in the killing of Collin Khosa. But before I get to that, Aubrey, the ANC issuing that statement calling for calm from Americans and the government there, and encouraging them to seek an amicable solution to what they call the current racial impasse. Now, firstly, labeling it a current impasse. Please speak to that, and also the whole notion of protest that then turns into violence and looting. Because my question is, does the looting then begin to detract from the message that sparked the protest initially?
Well, Sakina, the protests, with or without the violence. Now, you see in the UK, Boris Johnson, who is livid about the fact that a statue was thrown into a river. More livid about that act than about why the statue was thrown into the river. In America, we have seen people expressing anger against the violence of some of the protests because the shop window that was broken has more value than the black life that was taken. And unfortunately, as Muzi is saying, those who fought in the liberation struggle are not immune from the effects of whiteness and this pathology, white supremacy and racism. They too, to some extent, have internalized the logic of whiteness, and to some extent have succumbed to epistemic racism, and therefore suffer from epistemic civility and epistemic obedience, and which is betrayed by the kind of statements we are seeing coming out of the ANC at the moment.
And Advocate Skakane, quite apart from the ANC, and you can also opine on that, but quite apart from the outrage expressed by the ANC in terms of what happened to George Floyd and the relative, lack of outpouring of emotion to the death of Collin Khosa. In both cases, it's not just the ANC, but South Africans in the main who behaved in that manner. So what does that tell us about ourselves and the views that we hold inherently as South Africans about Black lives in this country?
Maybe that's due to the length of a week happened to us. Maybe because we were the last to be free, we carry that burden of seeing ourselves as cheap, of seeing Black lives as cheap and valueless. And I think it's one of the things we need to confront because its roots are exactly our political settlement. I've said before that our political settlement, hailed as a miracle, is accompanied by a desire for white appeasement. And I think that desire for white appeasement continues in the decisions that we make, in the policy direction that we take. And secondly, there is an issue in South Africa that we don't, racism of those who are white but call themselves progressive. I must look at that seriously because for me, I think some of the most serious perpetrators of racism are the so-called white left that you find in the mass democratic movement, who have the moral authority, at least as far as they think, who look at themselves as morally superior to their own comrades in the same structures, that they do not learn, and therefore they cannot prevent their own complicity in the perpetration of racism against Black people. And that is what the ANC has to confront head on so that it can actually recommit historic mission of liberating Black people in general and Africans in particular.
And that's quite a serious allegation that you make there, Advocate Skakane, because we will be told that these are people who, alongside Black South Africans, fought for the liberation of this country. They fought the struggle side by side with their Black comrades. So why would you make that sort of charge against them in 2020?
It's not a charge against them, it's a charge against humanity. It's a charge against all of us. And anyone who views what I say as an attack on him or her as an individual or a group, understand the effect of the damage that colonialism caused on all of us, me included. And so we need to honestly confront how we see Black lives, how we see their conditions, their lived experiences. I bet you if the soldiers had walked down the streets of Sandhurst and had seen a white family, a white man sitting on the stoop having a bride, they wouldn't have killed him. But they killed Collin Khosa. And those are things we need to confront head on if we are to really develop a truly non-racial South Africa.
Gogo Aubrey, let's get into that particular matter regarding Collin Khosa. And what did you make of the vindication of the soldiers involved in that report and also the conduct of the authorities in this regard, those who have oversight over those alleged to have perpetrated his killing?
Well, Sakina, we should not be surprised to some extent. We had on Friday a very good speech that was presented by the president of the ANC in response to the killing of George Floyd. Now, if you stay within the four corners of the speech and you ignore everything outside the four corners of the speech, that was a good speech. But if you get out of the four corners of the speech, you are forced to confront things like the fact that the speech did not say anything about Marikana. Why is that? It's like that because in Marikana, what you see is a state that privileges the interests of mining capital over the interest. And therefore, in the killing of Collin Khosa, you have state functionaries being motivated or driven by the same logic in the killing of this black man, Collin Khosa. And to go back to the issue of violent protests, you know, Sakina, whiteness has a tendency of changing the subject, but also has a tendency to try and frame the argument in accordance with what it desires. And that is why you see at the moment to try and change the subject or change the content of the argument against white racism. And therefore, when it comes to Collin Khosa again, I am not very surprised that the state has responded in the manner that it has, because anyway, if you look at some of his policies, particularly economic policy, anti-black, objectively anti-black and anti-poor, they betray the fact that even to the post-apartheid state, do not matter as they should, given the fact that these are black people who were victims of colonialism and apartheid.
Please hold that thought. I'm going to ask both of you gentlemen to stay with us. We just need to take news with Leanne at 8, and then we'll come back and we'll continue this conversation talking about Black Lives Matter and, of course, our response, not just as the South African nation, but also our government's response to what has been happening the world over. But let's get to Leanne to bring us up to speed with the latest news first.